As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. I first heard Laura Davis's name during a therapy session back in 2001. At the time, I was working through the sexual abuse that had happened to me during childhood. Her book, The Courage to Heal, not only made me feel less alone, it gave me the strength to heal myself and let go of the shame I'd been carrying. So when I discovered Laura's memoir, The Burning Light of Two Stars, in late 2021, I knew I had to buy this book. Yet I had no idea the story would arrive on the cusp of the next healing journey I'd embark on. Since reading her memoir, I've had the pleasure of following Laura on social media, where I've witnessed her generosity and grace. The books I've read are but 2 of the 7 groundbreaking works she's published. They are in addition to her publications in places like Publishers Weekly, Writer's Digest, Crime Reads, Brevity, and the New York Times, as well as her appearances on dozens of podcasts, including QWERTY, Right Minded, and The Only One in the Room. Laura also teaches writing classes and retreats and serves as a featured speaker at numerous conferences. To learn more about what she's up to, please read her full bio in the show notes. In today's episode, Laura generously shares her expertise as a writing instructor during a conversation we had about the healing power of writing, the difference between writing meant to heal and writing for a public audience, and the challenges she faced while crafting The Burning Light of Two Stars, which she's selling at a 70% discount through February 29th, 2024. Before we get to this episode, I have a few questions for you. What role has writing played in your life? If you've been writing for a while, which pieces have healed you most? Have you ever received feedback that something should be taken out of a piece of writing only to have a burning desire to keep it around? How do you know if a piece of writing is really ready to be published? I hope you'll ponder these questions while listening to today's episode. Now it's my great honor to share this interview with Laura Davis. Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. Well, hello, Laura Davis. Welcome to the Writing and Resilience podcast. I am so just overjoyed to have you on here today because I have been a fan of your work for many, many years.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very honored to be here.
Well, one of the things that we were talking about just before I hit the record button is the fact that your work has always come to me when I needed it. And so I always think of that Buddhist proverb, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And you have certainly been a teacher for me in my life. Earlier with The Courage to Heal, that was a profound experience for me. But what we're going to talk about today is your memoir, which for those of you who are watching the video, I have here, and you'll notice I have some tabs. The Burning Light of Two Stars, which also came to me at an important time in my life. And so I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about the book. What would you like us to know?
This is my 7th book, and the books I had written before were all about how to do something. So they were like information-based nonfiction, full usually of a lot of other people's stories and interviews. And, there were 4 books on healing from sexual abuse. There was a parenting book, Becoming the Parent You Want to Be. There was a book on estrangement and reconciliation called I Thought We'd Never Speak Again. And then I didn't publish anything for 19 years. So this book was gestating for a very long time, and it's a memoir. And it was the first time I wrote in a completely different genre, which is how do you tell a story? And this story, of course, drew threads from all the work I had done in the past, but in a very, very intimate and personal way. And this is a mother-daughter story, and it basically asks and answers the question, can you caretake a parent who betrayed you in the past? And, that was a question I have lived with my whole life. I think the first time I published something about my mother, I was 23 years old. So I've been writing about her and thinking about her for a very, very long time. And this is a book that I didn't really want to write, and I kept trying to put it aside. I kept wanting to walk away from it for many reasons. I didn't think I had the writing chops. I just didn't think I was capable of a story like this. I was deeply concerned about how my family would react because I had already been rejected and ostracized
Mhm.
from The Courage to Heal, my first book, which came out when I was 31 years old. I didn't want to go through that again. And I didn't think I had the memory to write a memoir. So there were a lot of reasons I kept wanting to say, I can't do this. And it was very painful and challenging to write. I had to come to terms with so much of
Yeah.
what was this story. But it just kept reasserting itself. It was like, you have to write this. And basically, you can't write anything else or do anything else until you commit to seeing this all the way through. So it took me 10 years to write. And I'm really, really proud of it. I had to learn so much in the process of writing it, both about this very primal relationship I had with my
Mhm.
mother, but also as a writer. And even though I have been a writing teacher for 25 years, I had to learn a whole new set of skills myself to be able to tell this story.
Isn't it so funny that the stories we have to tell just they will not let us go, right? We think that we have a choice, but we don't. These stories beg to be told, and I'm so glad that you told it, and I'm so glad that you told it in this way because there was an intimacy in this book. I was not just being told the different steps you can take to care for a parent. You take me inside a story that is at times beautiful and at times really gritty and very real. And, for those of us that are in this period of life where we are caring for parents, and especially if we've had challenging relationships with our parents in the past where betrayals have happened, we have to ask this question. We have to figure out what that answer is. And it can look out so many different ways. And for me, I felt like this book was a primer on forgiveness. I mean, I just felt like it was. I teach different classes on that. And if you want to figure out what that looks like, you need to go buy this book right now because there's so much in it that to me, I was just like, yes, this is the process. This is the way. And you tell it so gorgeously. No one would know you had to learn all these skills.
What's really interesting to me is I don't think I ever mentioned the word forgiveness ever in the book. I mean, it's not the framework with which I wrote it. I just told the story. And for me, it's really a story about reconciliation. And reconciliation to me doesn't necessarily mean a continuation or a resumption of
Yes.
a relationship with something. It's an internal coming to peace with a really
Mm-hmm.
challenging relationship. And that's what I had to do with my mother. And I never knew what would happen with her directly. My mother and I were completely estranged for a number of years. And then gradually, about the time I was in my mid 30s and started to have children, her grandchildren, we both really worked to try to rebuild some kind of relationship. And we reached some kind of, I like a status quo. There was an equilibrium. I never felt safe with her. I never revealed anything personal to her, but we had a functional relationship and it worked because she lived in New Jersey and I lived in
Yeah.
California. And that 3,000-mile buffer was really necessary for us to have this relationship, which I exerted a lot of control over. I had tons of rules. She often broke them, but I was always feeling like I had to protect myself from her. That was like the core feeling I had.
Yeah.
And then this book opens when she's 80 years old and she calls one day, the inciting incident, each story has something that kicks it into gear, is that she calls me and tells me she's moving to my town for the rest of her life. And then I have to deal with, how do I feel about that? And am I capable of being a daughter to
Yeah.
her for the rest of her life, despite this really complex and challenging history? And, it's interesting. You were saying the book is good for people who've had a difficult relationship with a parent, but I've heard from a lot of people who are in the position my mother was in, of facing their own aging or their own death,
Mm.
who have found the book really helpful, and people who had a good relationship with their family. I think it's really for anyone who's in the position of being a caregiver and the kind of stresses that puts on you, and also if you've had a really impossible relationship with anyone. How do you find a place of resolution and peace inside yourself, regardless of what that other person does?
Yeah, and I love how you broaden the audience for this because it is true. It can work for all kinds of audiences, especially for caregivers. I love that people who are facing the end of their lives and that final act are also finding so much meaning in this. So, this story takes place when the buffer is gone. And there's a way that what I saw in the writing, this other stuff that we're going to talk about later on, and it's like there's a way that you also took the buffer off for yourself when you were writing this. But what I want to know is what did you have to do to prepare emotionally for the rigors of telling this story?
It's a really good question. I think in part I have been teaching and practicing writing practice, which I learned from Natalie Goldberg many, many, many years ago. But I think having a practice of writing about the hardest things and
Yes.
not holding back and having a commitment to write for my own healing and my own clarification, my own self-knowledge has been a really critical part of my self-care for many, many decades. So I think having that core of a commitment to telling the real truth on the page, separate from how it looks. I have a lot of skill at the craft of writing, but I approach it very much as a emotional, spiritual practice. And
Yes.
so I think having that core practice and being able to write about the hardest things, not because it's going to fit in the book, but because that's how I get to the truth of the
Mm-hmm.
story. I think that was very much at the core of what enabled me to write this book. I have a friend, Susan Brown, she's now a retired creative writing teacher, and she works with a lot of writers. And she read a very early draft of this book, and she basically tore it apart. And she said, "You're spending so much time making yourself look good. You're making yourself the
Mm.
hero of the story." And then she said to me, she said, "Laura, this is not the courage to heal." She was referencing my first book. She said, "This is the courage to reveal."
Ooh, I
And
love
so
that.
and then I didn't speak to her for about 6 months. But I put on my wall right in front of where I'm sitting right now, right, in the what's it's the courage to reveal. And that really helped me to really start looking at my own underbelly. And I think that's when people read the book and they say, they can't believe what I revealed or that it just was so real. They really appreciate that. And
Mm-hmm.
I wanted people to come to this book and read it and not think, "Oh, Laura is the hero and her mother is the villain," which is
Yes.
where many people start when they're writing memoir. There's often this little bit of revenge or I'm going to set the record straight. I wanted people to read it and to say, on this page, I loved your mother and I hated you. And on this page, I hated your mother and loved you. And that is the way people respond. There's two very human, flawed characters on the page. And that was very intentional. But that took years to kind of write
Mm-hmm.
into that level of truth. I wanted to, wanted to hold back on some things. I didn't want people to know something about me, and I had to really let that go to make the book successful and to tell the story true.
Yeah, and I want to get to some of the things that are needed to get there. But we want to read a quote from your book. And this is in one of these additional pieces. We're going to talk about what those are in a moment. But you write, a truth teller can only tell as much of the truth as she can face at a given time, which I thought was such a profound statement. And when it comes to the writing process, and I view it as a spiritual practice as well. And I always tell people, if you're going to write and you have a choice between being published and settling something inside yourself that really opens your soul, do that work. Like, that's the sacred work of writing. That's the most important thing. But it takes time to do that. And there are things that can get in the way of us being able to face the truth. So I want to talk about, how do we heal with writing and how do we do this work? Because so many people want to do it.
Yeah, so I've committed my whole career basically to that, to serving what you're talking about. And I love the way you framed it. For me, I only work in groups. I don't work one-on-one with people. I only work in like an online class, or I teach a lot of writing retreats because there's something about the container of the workshop, which is I'm responsible for, like creating
Mm-hmm.
a really sacred space where it's safe for people to open up. But there's also what happens when one person writes about something, they crack the potential for that same topic open for someone else. So I'm thinking of an example. Years ago, I teach a Wednesday morning writing class that I've taught for over, I don't know, over 20 years. And one day there was a woman who'd been in there for quite a while, a couple of years, and I don't remember what prompt I gave, but she wrote a piece about her son being a heroin addict.
Mm,
I knew that about her because often as a teacher, I know more about my students, but
yeah.
it had never been written about in class. And so no one in the class knew. You know, in a writing class, you only know about people what they share.
Right.
And then we took a break. You know, everybody was really listened with a lot of compassion to her. And I think her writing was held in a really sacred space. And then we took a break and then we came back. And in the next writing prompt, which was something completely different, I always tell people if there's something pressing that you need to write, ignore the prompt I give you and write that thing that really has
Yes.
to be written. Two people came in and wrote about relatives who were heroin addicts.
Mm,
And these people had all been in class together for a long time. But it was because the first woman had the courage and the need to write the story that
yes.
day. Suddenly that topic was open to the group. So I love that kind of group dynamic and the way that being witnessed when you write to me is
Mm-hmm.
it's like writing is like the inhalation, but having it shared is like the exhalation.
Yes.
And if your writing just festers in your notebook, it's not the same as having it witnessed, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
I like to see it witnessed in a group or with one other person, other safe person. And even if someone is not ready to do that, to read it out loud to themselves
Mm-hmm.
so that that story comes through your vocal cords. And when you speak it, it's a different level of breaking silence than just having it on the page. So I think that's really important. And in terms of setting a container for safety where people can really write a lot, the first thing is there has to be absolute confidentiality. People have to
Yes.
feel like whatever
Absolutely.
they share or say in a writing group will never be repeated. When I'm doing writing with people where it's more this kind of like excavation of sometimes it's things from the past or their present, that the important thing is that they go all the way down to the core and write it and that it can be exploratory, that you don't know where it's going. I also like to pair, sometimes I'll give someone a prompt that's, you know, some of them could be very open-ended. One of my favorites I've been using is, this is the way things are right now. And
Mm,
it's just a repeating line, you know, this is the way things are right now. And then you write something and then you put that line in again. This is the way things are right now.
mm-hmm.
And sometimes I'll suggest that people, especially right now with everything we're facing in our world, to consciously structure it so that the first, this is the way things are right now, is maybe you're writing about the images of babies dying in Gaza and
Yeah.
buildings being bombed. And then the next, this is the way things are right now, you're writing about you walked out and what the sunrise was like that
Mm-hmm.
morning, or so that you're pairing what's challenging with the beauty that still exists in the world. Because I feel like that's so much all of our challenge right now is how can we
Yeah.
be witness to everything that is happening and not just go numb or avoid, but also find those daily moments of joy. So I encourage people to do that in their writing. So there has to be confidentiality, there has to be safety. I love teaching retreats because at a retreat, you leave your life behind and you're able to just go so much deeper. And the other thing I think is really important is not just to excavate with writing, but also to give people prompts that will help them find their resilience and their strength. So it
Yes.
might be, you know, I might give a prompt that's really challenging or that brings people into their grief or their pain or something like that, but then I might follow it with, you know, something like what gives me strength or the ground on which I stand, or tell me about a moment of joy that you experienced in the last week and bring us fully into that moment with all your senses intact so that there's both a building up and an excavating going
Mm-hmm.
on at the same time. And that there also needs to be that witnessing. And also, like if I teach a retreat, there will be a session in the morning and then the whole afternoon might be open. And I always want to teach in a beautiful place so that people could go out and be in nature. And there's that, the feeling of like the earth is the container. It's not just,
Mm-hmm.
you know, so I think there's a lot of ways to create that safety and to hold people's stories as sacred. They
No,
are sacred. Everybody has their own story and they're all worth telling. They're all needed.
absolutely. Every single one. And There's a magic that happens when people come together
Mhm.
and just offer their attention, their silence and their attention to your story. And that is, I think, one of the most important things that can happen in a group. And so I'm right there with you. I think there are things that can be accomplished in the group setting that absolutely cannot be accomplished when you're working one on one. And it's that connection piece and also the inspiration piece. And you listen to what someone's saying and going like, oh, yes, yes, that. And I also love that prompt that you mentioned. This is the way things are right now, both for the purpose that you're talking about, that juxtaposition of the dark and the light. But also, one of the things that I often talk with writers about is the fact that when you're writing memoir, and you mentioned that there can be this revenge piece or this upset piece when you're first starting to write, is that one of the first things that often has to speak is the wounded part of you, and giving yourself permission, even if that first draft is just the revenge draft, which we know is not the finished draft. It is not the finished draft. But sometimes you have to give voice to the pain in order to have perspective. And being able to give voice to that pain, but remind yourself this is the way things are right now, shows that your perspective is going to change. And just even writing something down changes the perspective that you have about what has happened.
Yes, it definitely does. And I think we need to get all of that out. And to have it witnessed is so powerful, and I mean, like an intense rant is very welcome in a writing group. There's a difference between what we write for ourselves, which is, you could call it therapeutic writing, or writing as healing, or writing as self-exploration. There's a difference between that and what we write for an audience. I've had many students come to a class and they're doing a lot of personal writing, and then they get to a point where they may decide, like, I want other people to read this. Like, this theme of what I'm writing about is just so compelling. I want to keep doing it and I want to publish something. Then the stakes are very, very different.
Yes.
When I'm working with people who are writing as a tool for healing, we're not critiquing their writing.
Mm-hmm.
We're not saying you could do this better or you could do that better, or why don't you start here and just cut off the first 2 pages. There's none of that. It's that deep listening and being witnessed.
Yes.
But when someone then wants to publish something, the stakes are very different and the standards are really different. And then the question of craft becomes critical. And I think also, just because you suffered, just because you had a really, really bad experience, or even a really, really good experience, doesn't necessitate an audience. How many hundreds of thousands of books have been written about someone's sexual abuse trauma, or their adoption story, or their abortion story, or their fill in the blank, their child who died? I mean, these are all critical experiences for the writer, but to make them something for a reader requires a whole different element of being capable of telling a compelling story, because people don't care about you unless they know you,
Yeah.
unless they're in your writing group, or they're in your
Mm-hmm.
friend group or your family. To go beyond that requires a different set of skills. And I like to support people in both, both
Mm-hmm.
that really deep personal exploration, which is sort of my home base, but also then how do you take that and make it into something that someone else will want to read?
Absolutely. And I do a lot of that same work. And in fact, in the first episode for this podcast, I talk about how some of the people I've worked with have gone on and had, like, big books that they have published. And then I had this one client who said, I just want to write this book to heal my family.
Mm.
And to me, that was the best experience. I mean, it was just amazing because I was like, this is why we write. This is the power. When you're working with someone and one of your students, or even just when you're thinking about yourself, how do you know, like, almost even at a body level, that the shift has been made between this is writing for healing versus I'm going to take this and make it for an audience? Like, what is that like for you? And then what do you see in your students that tells you the shift is there?
Well, I think, the first thing is, I think when people are beginners or they're writing for themselves, they write a draft and that's it. But
Mm-hmm.
when you're writing for an audience, every word in my memoir, every scene was rewritten at least 100 times. So you start to rework a piece, and it's not just about your experience, not just capturing your experience, but how do you translate that experience to someone else? So, people start looking at things like structure. They start looking at things like, how do you write dialogue. They look at things like, how do you build tension in a scene? What do you reveal and what do you conceal? When do you
Hmm.
reveal things to the reader? And I think the first thing is someone has to be willing to look at their work objectively and be willing to hear how it impacts other people. That sometimes the response to a piece of writing is, thank you for your courage, keep going. If
Hmm.
it's really raw and they're really in the throes of their process, then it's not appropriate to give other kind of feedback. But when someone is reworking something, I mean, my experience is I got more and more distant from the experience so that it
Yeah.
became a product. It became something for others, and that I began to look at each scene from the point of view of the reader.
Hmm.
And part of my process for all the 7 books I've written is to use a lot of beta readers, which means that I would take a draft of my manuscript, usually at several points in its evolution, and send it to many people to read with a specific set of questions. I struggled a lot with how to open this book. There were so many different threads. The
Yes.
first third was really problematic. So one of my questions was, if you hadn't said you would read this, would you have kept reading? It was really
Mm.
important for me to ask that
Hmm.
question.
Yeah.
And it was hard when people said, no, I wouldn't. And there was a point where most people said, no, I wouldn't have, because it wasn't constructed properly. It wasn't written right. And you need to be able to know that, because, as I say, you have like 2 seconds to get people's attention. And then
Right.
another 5 seconds if they read the first paragraph and then or the first page when they're making that decision if it's a book they want to read. I mean, I'm always getting books where I read a sample. I download a lot of samples of books and I might decide to read 20% of them. And I
Hmm.
could tell after I've read a page or two, nope, yep. So that's how people are assessing us.
So,
I could tell that people are ready because they become more objective about their work. They're able to see it as something to communicate to others rather
mhm.
than something just to communicate with themselves.
Yeah, and I think for me that shift happens when I begin to think about what is the question that I'm answering for other people, or what
Yeah.
are the gaps that are there in the conversation, because you have to figure out what has yet to be said and how your work can contribute to that. Especially when it comes to stories where a lot of people have written about certain issues. I think it's important to think about, where's the gap? What is the thing that's yet to be said that I'm saying? Because it's there. If you look for it, it's just a matter of finding that. And so I love that you are working with writers in both ways, and that you work with them for a long enough period of time in your classes, at least, to where you get to see that evolution happen. But one of the things you do that's a little bit more short term that allows you to build that safe container and your ability to really bear witness are some of these retreats that you teach. And you have one that's going to be coming up on a topic that is near and dear to my heart as a survivor of suicide loss who's written a lot about grief. And that is a retreat on grief. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is a retreat I started teaching after my mother died, which was, I think, 9 years ago. So I think I've maybe run it 10 or 11 times. And it's writing as a pathway through grief, loss, uncertainty, and change. It's a week-long retreat, and it's structured so that people can come who are dealing with all kinds of levels of grief. So it could
Yeah.
be someone has died. It could be, like you said, a survivor of a suicide. It could be someone who's dealing with a diagnosis, or someone
Mm-hmm.
who they're just dealing with aging and there are a lot of losses involved in their life is not the way it used to be, or someone who is maybe they're going to retire and like, what is the next phase of my life going to be? Or someone who just got a divorce, or they're dealing with empty nest, or some kind of just that ennui we experience of like,
Mm-hmm.
my life feels stale and I need something else and I don't know what it is. So it's those times of uncertainty. And it's so this retreat has kind of a big umbrella, and it's a incredibly intimate and powerful way to do some really deep self-exploration. And I think one of the things that I love about the retreat is that, first of all, people get incredibly bonded, but also that there's often a lot of tears. It's a grief retreat, but
Mm-hmm.
there's concurrently so much laughter. That there's just, when you crack things open for people and you're witnessed, this also a joy and connection comes out, and people leave feeling very, very bonded. So that retreat it's in Northern California at a retreat center called Mount Madonna in Watsonville, California. The dates are May 7th to May 13th. And if you could find out about it at lauradavis.net/grief, and that will be in the show notes. But it's a really powerful container. I teach it with a wonderful woman named Evelyn Hall, who creates an incredible sacred space for the group and really helps ground us all physically and keep us present. And it's really one of my favorite things I do all year is that retreat.
Well, when I was looking at the description of the retreat and seeing the pictures, it is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, I was like, oh, if only we could all live our lives right there. But then if we did, we wouldn't be able to appreciate the beauty of being able to go to a place like this. And another thing that I was really noting is that, you have these structured times when people are getting together, but there is an invitation for rest,
Yeah.
for joy, for play, and for rest. And that is so important when you are navigating grief, whether it is fresh grief or it is old grief or it's a grief for a variety of different reasons. That opportunity to rest, so important.
Yes, it is. I love leading retreats, and one of the things I love about it is that I have to be able to really read the room. And
Mm-hmm.
I have a curriculum, an idea of what the flow of the retreat, and there always is a certain flow that happens. But I also have to respond to what's happening in the moment. And,
Yes.
it may be that I'm planning to give people a certain writing prompt, and I just look around and I could see it's the energy in the room is already so heavy. I need to do something to lighten it up and to
Mm.
ground people, and so we'll do something completely different. So I really like that feeling of moving a group through a process. And also, yeah, like you said, people go for hikes, they go for walks, they sit outside. There's a little cafe there where people could go in and get a tea. There's a bookshop. So there's like opportunities to step out of the intensity of the
Mm-hmm.
retreat, but still being on this incredible piece of land that is separate from your daily life, which I think is sometimes we can't do this kind of work. I mean, what you could do like week by week with a therapist or even week by week in a writing group is very different than what you get when you dive in for 7 days and you really
Yes.
let your life go.
I think we need retreat now more than ever because we are so overstimulated. We need to be able to hear ourselves think. That's so essential to the creative process. And a piece of your creative process that you really had to be able to listen into is, where in the world do you start this book?
Yeah, that was a big struggle.
Ah, I am feeling your pain as a person who has a book on submission. I rewrote the beginning of my book 100 times. It wasn't just rewriting the actual sentences, it was like figuring out where to begin and how to move through time and what actually belongs. I mean, it's so challenging, but you have crafted this so masterfully. And I was wondering, because I'm a deep admirer of this book and also an admirer of this piece, would you be willing to read the prologue and then to talk about why you're starting here?
First, I just want to say I didn't call it a prologue. I'm laughing because you listen to a lot of people who give advice about literary submissions. They really tell you don't have a prologue, that publishers don't like it, editors don't like it, agents don't like it. So I broke the rule by writing this little piece and putting it in the front. Anyway, so I'll just read it and then I'll talk about it. So this is called Spark. Summer 1956, Long Branch, New Jersey. I started life in a glass box. I lay alone, barely breathing, eyelids thin, light stabbing, body on fire, nerves raw, beeps piercing my tiny ears. I couldn't swallow, I couldn't suck, tubes down my nose, wires on my skin. Where was she? The heartbeat that had answered my own, that soft, slippery chest pressed to mine. For 7 months, I'd held my twin in my arms. Even when we had no arms, I held her. She was always smaller, even when we were just a thought, a zygote, an embryo. She grew beside me quarter ounce by quarter ounce, her pulse the echo of my own. Weeks went by, then months, she floating in the safety of my embrace, till the walls of our watery home began to squeeze. Our mother was 28 years old. She'd already had 2 late miscarriages. She thought she was losing another baby. She had no idea that we were two. At birth, a nurse placed me on the scale, 2 pounds, 12 ounces, a scrawny chicken. As they rushed me to the neonatal intensive care unit, the doctor said, "Hold on, Mrs. Davis. There's another one coming." That's how she learned about my sister. Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. The two of us, identical. My twin lived 24 hours. I never felt her again.
Mm.
The rabbi advised, don't build a monument to someone who never existed. So my secret sister never had a memorial or funeral or a grave. But Mom insisted on giving her a name, Vicky. For 6 weeks after my birth, no one was allowed to hold me, and I touched no one. Doctors didn't believe in holding preemies in 1956. I spent the next 6 weeks in a hard glass box, an isolette, the perfect name for my healing prison. It isolated me from the broad expanse of my father's chest, my brother Paul's laughter, my mother's eager arms. Nurses wearing rubber gloves reached in to adjust my tubes, check my wires, change my tiny diaper. The whoosh of machines, the tick-tock of the clock, a pale shadow of the heartbeat that had sustained me, the one I had sustained. The nurses took notes on hard brown clipboards and moved on to the next tiny baby. They did what they could and left me alone. Babies my size weren't supposed to survive. If I made it, the doctor said I'd probably be blind or retarded. If I made it, I'd be strong, a survivor. My whole life rolled out from that beginning. When I think back now, here's how I imagine it. A newborn, tiny, weak, and in pain. My twin had died, and I could have followed her. Perhaps part of me wanted to just let go and disappear. But then I felt her, Tammy Davis, the woman standing outside my clear glass box, pulling me to her, willing me to live. My baby, oh, my baby, let me hold you in my arms. Beaming her life force through those hard walls. Stay with me, darling. Please be my baby. She pulled me into her blazing, broken heart and claimed me as her daughter. Stay with me, she said. Whatever you do, don't ever leave. And so I said yes to life, yes to my mother. I had no idea just how much of a challenge that was going to be.
Mm. Such a great opening.
It's fun to read it out loud. I haven't read it out loud probably since I recorded the audiobook a couple of years ago.
Those of you who were watching, I was like looking down at the book and then I was like, no, I don't need to look down. I just need to listen to Laura's beautiful voice. So, why did you start here?
It's such a great question. It was such a challenge. I mean, for me, I'm a sexual abuse survivor. My grandfather sexually abused me, which is a thread in this book. I had a mother who was, incredible narcissist, although I never name her as that in the book. I don't think you ever label people, you just show their behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But I had this incredibly difficult relationship with her. Grew up in the 60s. I had a lot of my father left and became a hippie. There are a lot of things in my life that were strong influences. But from the perspective now, I look back and I feel like the most significant thing was the loss of my identical twin sister. Like I feel like it shaped everything about me. And it felt like it was really important to include it in the memoir. And yet I got so much pushback from different editors I worked with, different people who read it. It's just like, you're trying to do too many things. It's too complicated. Just cut the twin sister. And I didn't, I insisted on keeping her as a thread. She's sort of like I don't know, like a little guardian angel that sees me through the book. And there's not many mentions of her. But when I was working with a coach for this book, he had me write a list of secret bonds I kept with my mother
Mm-hmm.
because there was so much tearing and destruction between the two of us, so many points of disconnection.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had me make a list of these connections because I think people reading the book would be like, why did these two people ever even try to reconcile? Like this situation is so impossible. And one of them was my twin sister because my mother named her, and throughout her life, periodically she and I would talk about Vicky, my twin.
Hmm.
And she was the only person in the whole universe who shared that loss with me.
Yes.
And that really created a bond that I don't think I really understood until many, many years later, but that was a connection. And I put that thread in the book. I tried this book without this opening many times. I kept putting it back, and it was a lot longer. I made it a lot shorter. I think I also saw my relationship with my mother as kind of more of this like epic spiritual journey. I don't even know if I believe in lifetimes, but it feels like it extended through lifetimes, and that this frame from my birth until her death is the framework of this book. And the intensity with which this relationship played out in those 57 years was very, very strong. And I felt like it started at this moment, and it felt like there was this pact between the two of us that I was going to be there for her. And I think I wasn't consciously aware of it, but I feel like when she came to California at the end of her life, it almost felt like this karmic duty. And I don't mean to say that daughters in particular are responsible and should always show up for an elderly parent. I actually wrote an afterword at the end of the book, which I felt was really important to include, that basically said, if you are struggling with a difficult relationship, you do not have to do what I did. That
Hmm.
was the gist of it. I didn't want to have this thing of like, oh, everyone should be. Sometimes the best choice is to walk away
Yeah.
for your own mental, psychological health. If someone is really, really toxic, then no, you should not take care of them at the end of their lives. I mean, each person's situation is different. I didn't want people to read this book and say, oh, well, Laura Davis says I need to show up. I have to do. No, you don't have to do anything. I think each person has to evaluate their own situation. With my mother, there was enough glue. There was enough that was positive in the relationship that for me, it was the right choice. It was the right choice to take care of her. And it aided my own evolution as a human being. I mean, I think giving birth cracked me open the two times I did that. And then seeing my mother through her death also cracked me open in a whole different way. And I was able to see, I think one of the things about reconciliation is that in order to find peace, we have to see these relationships from a much bigger perspective. When
Hmm.
we're just caught in the day to day of it, the me and mom kind of thing. And I wrote about this in the book, that over the course of time, I started to see her as more than just my mother,
Hmm.
my difficult mother. I started to see her as a daughter. I started to see her as the child of poor immigrants in New York City. I started to see her from a perspective of so many other things that shaped her and her life. And then I was able to view her from a completely different lens. But that took many years of therapy and healing, and being able to shout out my anger, my rage, my frustration, my all those other things had to come first to get to that point of being able to see her clear, to see her as human in a way
Hmm.
that I just couldn't when I was only seeing her as as the daughter.
And I think you render this so well in the book. And there are so many beautiful scenes that just this is great storytelling. And interspersed within this storytelling, there are also these other sections, which I'm going to allow you to label them. These other sections, and I actually read all of the sections together and they tell their own story, which I really
Right.
loved in reading that. So, why did you put in these pieces where you are looking at these letters that are between
Right.
mother and daughter? And there are other things in there, but what did you hope to accomplish by interrupting the narrative with these other pieces?
Well, that's another thing that so many people said, take them out, take out these letters. So just to explain for people who are watching or listening, is that there's the story, there's like a ticking clock that basically is
Mm-hmm.
from the moment she calls and says, I'm coming to California, until a little bit after her death. And that's one storyline. So those scenes are the whole story of basically her arrival, the accommodations I have to make, her aging, her dementia, the choices I have to make at the end of her life, and what happens with our relationship and her diminishment. And it's a lot about aging in America and through her death. So that's one. And then there's a second thread, which is all the things that happened in the past that brought us to the point of being so deeply estranged. And also the process of reconciliation we went through
Yes.
when I was in midlife. So there's both the things from the past, and then there's this contemporary thread, which is that frame from her arrival to her death. And then there's this third piece you're talking about. My mother and I, during the years we weren't speaking and beyond that, had a really amazing correspondence. And when she died, and I was going through her things, I found this shoebox that had all the letters I had ever written to her, all the letters she had ever written to me. She had copied them, and drafts of the uncensored letters. And in my things, I had the same. And so when I put together all of her letters and all of my letters, because we both had some, the other didn't, there was like probably like a foot and a half thick
Mm.
file of this incredible correspondence that started when I was a teenager and ended in my early 30s, because we weren't writing letters anymore, and we were starting to have more connection at that point. And the letters were incredible. And I at first I actually wrote an early draft of this book that was only epistolary. It was only the letters, and then I wrote new letters like "Dear Mom" about her to her after she died. So the whole book was letters, and I wrote the whole draft. I sent it to people, and they just said, "I feel like I'm on the outside of a private conversation.
Mm.
Like just write it in scenes. Like just give us the story." So I was very committed to this idea of including these letters. The other reason I wanted to include them is the letters from her, which are very edited. I mean, they're not like, I just took parts. It's the only time she gets to speak in her real voice.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it's through my lens, my interpretation, my recreation of what happened and what she said and what I said. And the letters let her speak for herself. And I felt like that was really important. The other thing that was important to me is that when I sat down and read these letters, like I had always had this story about my mother, the way I
Mhm.
told, this is what happened, this is the way it is. Basically, this is how she screwed up, this is how she betrayed me, this is how difficult she was. And I had all these things in my head. Like, for instance, we didn't speak for 7 years. I always would proclaim that. When I read these letters, I realized that my view, my reported view of what had happened was not accurate.
Mhm.
It was accurate, it was not complete. And that I had really focused on so much on all the negative. And when I started reading these letters, there were some really nasty exchanges between the two of us, but there were a lot of really incredibly loving, generous letters from her to me, and some from me to her. And I realized that we actually had never had that 7 years where there was nothing between us.
Mm.
We had been writing these letters. And I felt like the letters could tell a different level of the truth
Yes.
of the story than I could with my biased point of view and my poor memory. So I felt like they were important to include. And some of those pieces are reflecting my reflections after her death.
Mhm.
Like, so there's an epigraph in the front of the book by a writer, Deborah Fruchet, and it says, "Every time I look in the rearview mirror, the past has changed."
Mhm.
And I think that's so important for memoir writers because, when I started writing this book, I wrote it one way. When it was finished 10 years later, the story had definitely evolved and changed and was centered in a different way. And if I were to write it now, it would be different again.
Mhm.
So those letters were a way of bringing in her voice and also raising this question of how accurate are our memories as memoirists. That's one place I wanted to be really honest, was all the ways that I had held on to this set story, this is why people can't reconcile, even in themselves, is that we're
Mhm.
very attached to our victim story. And it's not
Yes.
to say we weren't victimized or terrible things weren't done, but there's a way that we have to hold things more loosely
Mhm.
as we heal. Don't have to, but it's a natural, for me, it was a natural outgrowth of my own healing process that I was able to kind of go from this, you know, to this. And that's what I wanted my story to reflect.
And I'm so glad that you trusted your gut and that you added all of these things in because I think they're absolutely essential. And you are able to do a certain kind of reflective work in this text by adding
Right.
in these additional
Mhm.
pieces that I don't think would have worked if you had tried to add it, at the end of chapters or things like that. I think it works perfectly the way it is. And I also think that as you keep talking about reconciliation, I think that your reconciliation, my definitions of forgiveness are actually the same thing, just two different words.
Yeah.
But I love this book, and you know what? Everyone needs to go out and buy a copy because it is gorgeously written, and I'm just such a big fan. I always end by asking three lightning round questions, and I want to ask them in lightning round form because I know you have somewhere else to be. So, you've given us so much writing advice. Is there one last thing you'd like to say about writing for those writers listening?
Yeah. Start with going really deep for yourself. Don't start with the idea of a product or a project. Write because you want to get to the deep truth for yourself and commit to that process first before you try to craft something for other people.
Beautiful. And what is one way you nurture your resilience?
Yeah, well, this is going to sound silly maybe, but my son and daughter-in-law came for a visit from Boston to California, and they brought in August, they brought these little crochet kits about learning to crochet. And I have become a crocheter. I'm a beginner, but I every day I spend an hour or two crocheting, and it feels almost like I'm crocheting the world back together. And it's also very good for the brain. And I
Mm-hmm.
have a mother who had dementia, so I'm really interested in brain health. And it's just really, it's like a meditative practice. I just love it. So crocheting and being in nature, those are my, hiking, being physical in nature, those are the two things that feed my soul the most.
My grandma was a huge crocheter. I mean, she could make anything. I mean, I can all
Well, I
kinds of
could
stuff. We could
barely
have
make
a,
anything and I'm still really enjoying it.
and I think that's the thing. I when I crochet, it's like crooked chain, and that's
Yeah,
about what I
totally.
get. So to wrap up, what are the ways people can reach you? If they want to learn more about your retreat or your book or anything else, how can they find you?
The best is my website, which is lauradavis.net. Also, the memoir is right now available at a 70% off sale till the end of January. And you could get to that link by going to lauradavis.net/70. And it's the number, not written out. lauradavis.net/70. And for the grief retreat I talked about again, the URL for that is lauradavis.net/grief. And yeah, my website has everything, has all the other classes and workshops and trips and other things I lead. And I hope I get to meet some of you in the next year.
And all of this will be in the show notes, along with any social media handles that you would like
Mhm.
us to have. And so, thank you so much. And I hope I get to meet you in the next year.
Oh, I would love
I
that
would love
too.
that.
Yeah,
So, thank you again for being on the podcast today. It has been a joy and a pleasure. And I'm just going to be reading and rereading your book because it speaks to the season of my life and the reconciliation work that I have to do.
thank you. Pleasure to talk to you.
Hey, writers, have you started a memoir only to get lost in a sea of stories that never seems to end, or completed a few drafts and now wonder if the structure you've chosen for your memoir is the best one for your book? Or have you queried a few agents only to hear, sorry, it's not for me, or worse, radio silence? You might not know this, but structure is the concept writers struggle with most. They worry about it during their first drafts and all along the way. There's a very good reason why this happens. An ineffective structure can lose readers, trap you in an endless cycle of revision, or worst of all, get you so lost you give up. But that doesn't have to happen to you. On February 21st, I'm teaming up with Jane Friedman to bring you Find the Memoir Structure That Works for You. During this webinar, you'll discover why writers crave structure and why stories need them. You'll also learn how to assess your skills and vision for this project, explore the most common memoir structures, and find out what skills are needed to nail each one. Best of all, it's only $25. That's right, $25. Plus, you don't even have to be available on February 21st because everyone who registers will get the recording, transcript, Q&A, and my comprehensive workbook. To learn more or register, go to janefriedman.com/courses or make it super easy on yourself and just click the link in the show notes. You'll leave with a new understanding of not just how stories are told, but confidence in your vision for your book, as well as a clear plan for getting there. To find the memoir structure that works for you, click on the link in the show notes, then register for this course. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing Your Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.